I'm welcoming you here to the very first Jarvis Con, the first talk of the first Jarvis Con. We're very, very happy and glad to have an amazing speaker, John Benac, who's joining us from NanoRex today. And we're very much looking forward to that. I'll just give you a bit of a hint of how we're going to guide you today through this event. So basically what you're looking at is there's going to be a small agenda, and the agenda is going to be that we will start with around 15 minutes of warm-up. So if you want to join the warm-up session, I'm going to have some questions for all of you. Then just go to this link, and you can, the link that is shown up the upper side of the screen, and then you can participate in answering these questions. After that warm-up session, we're going to listen to the talk of John. Very much looking forward to that. And then afterwards, we're going to have a 15-minute Q&A session. As you might have noticed, you're all muted by default. So the way this Q&A session later will work is that you write a short message on the chat to Maria Perez. She's the co-host of this meeting. And here I already want to say thank you very much, Maria, for organizing these talks. It has been quite a lot to bring all of these things together to line up the speakers. So if you're seeing today this is also because our team has been working very hard. I'll give a short introduction to us, who we are. Most of you might have heard of us before. So we're Valley Space. We're a smart collaboration platform for engineers. And with this, what we do is, as our mission, to empower engineers all over the world to build complex products. And that's why we see it as part of our mission to bring together the best minds in engineering. And that's hopefully several of our speakers, as well as many of you here, to have lessons learned and masterclass where we can get information from the speaker, but then also hopefully learn from each other during this. So let's dive right in. That's enough from me. I'd actually learned quite a lot rather about you. So I'm really curious. As I said, I see here like 30 something, almost 40, 36 members. So if you want to join the conversation, just go on your phone or on your computer to this URL, and then you can participate. So first question I have from you is which country you're joining from today. So just join this link, and then you should be able to type. And yeah, we see the first parts coming up here. Lots of European, there's South Africa, Canada, France, UK, Germany, Spain. That looks very international. Great. So I think that gives us an overview of where everyone comes from. That's, I would say, as very typical for space, probably very mixed all around the world. So let's get to learn a bit more about you. So which work background do you have? So I have here systems engineer, project manager, project engineer, customer management, innovation manager, students, investors, others. Nice. And for everyone who's writing to me in the chat for the answers for these questions, that's also great. If you can join to this link, then we will also all be able to see your answers. So yeah, I think this looks pretty much like lots of systems engineers, students, a bit of customer management is there, which is not so surprising for this talk, project managers, and some others. One innovation manager. Okay, great. And then maybe last question towards you in the sense of where you come from. So which industry do you work in? Yeah, that's maybe not so surprising. We made the first Jarvis Con a space edition. I was curious to see whether we would attract also people from other industries to learn from it. Oh, we see one automotive. Great. So mostly space folks out here. So John, you have already an idea, but there's also a few other industries. So there's already an idea of who's coming. So let's look a bit forward. So here are some fun questions. So these are a bit of icebreakers to get to know you from a not so serious side. So who do you think is the person who will bring mostly the first human to Mars? That's an interesting race. Oh, there's probably someone with a startup who's also bringing people to Mars themselves. That's good. Okay, amazing. Thanks for the answers. And then if we're already going to Mars, I'm curious to hear from you. If you could be on the first rocket to Mars, would you go? Okay, so I think safety is a concern. Like many people confident that Elon will do it, but
maybe it depends on the rocket.
Great. Okay, but now let's come to a few more serious questions. So questions that are also related to this talk today. So I'm curious to hear, does your organization today have a formal way to bring customer voices to the engineers? At least I think that's gonna get interesting, John, about the few opinions that engineers probably shouldn't have any contact with customers.
Yep.
Okay, that's quite some answers. And then what I would suggest is the last question for today, for the warm-up session, is which words do come to mind when you think of customer voice in engineering? So you can either post one or several words actually here. So, and if you repeat words that you see because you want to emphasize them, they become bigger.
Money. I like that one.
Yeah, really good, interesting points in here. Iterative, UX, transparency, I mean, requirements. Otherwise, we wouldn't probably be in space. Feedback. Great. Well, thank you very much for participating in this interactive part of the warm-up. And what I'd like to do now is actually to come to the part you've probably all have been waiting for. So I want to quickly go ahead and introduce John. So John, as you have seen, he works at Nanorex for Future Systems, and what he does is he has been working lots of space enterprises along the life cycle, working on different kinds of space vehicles, and he believes in the expanding human activity in space and hopes that it will bring prosperity to all of us. And he lives in Houston, loves to explore planet Earth, and while planning at the same time the exploration of development of the solar system. So I'm really, really excited to have you here, John, today. And what I would say is, well, take it away.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay. So, yes, I'm John Benac. I'm at NanoRacks, and I'm the Director of Advanced Concepts, where I'm able to work on lots of really fantastic products. NanoRacks is commercializing low Earth orbit. We've been on the space station serving hundreds of customers for a long time. And in my career, I've been able to work with all different kinds of customers. And, you know, the message and the customer needs, I've seen it very effectively communicated to engineers who are solving the problems, and sometimes there's a bit of a disconnect. So I wanted to talk about that, you know, why this is something that's worth our attention in different ways, and also hear from some of the participants about, you know, the unique viewpoints and advantages that y'all are coming from. So, let's see. All right, problem solving, okay? Problem solving is an important skill. How do we do it? How do we have that skill of problem solving? So any organization has a purpose, and organizations will interact with each other when they need to work with each other to you know, accomplish their shared goals. And this usually involves problem solving. Your customer has a problem, they can't solve it themselves, so they come to another organization that can solve it. And you know, customers are different. The problems that they want to have solved are different. Engineers aren't necessarily customer oriented. And I kind of agree with some of the feedback earlier that, you know, maybe engineers shouldn't be spending as much time talking to customers, because that's not necessarily, you know, what their greatest competency is engaging with customers. So leaders, management, and engineers need to be mindful and deliberate in order to address customer needs. And that doesn't mean that, you know, engineers are always talking to customers. So René Descartes, he was a philosopher hundreds of years ago, and he had this document called Rules for the Direction of the Mind. A lot of people know René Descartes for some of his mathematical contributions, but he said that we need to break up our work into small steps that we can understand completely and about which we have utter certainty. So when you have a big problem, you know, you need to look at it in smaller parts. Sometimes people say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Well, this is very similar to the more recent discipline of systems engineering and this concept of functional decomposition, which is breaking down the overall function of a device, system, or process into smaller parts. Well, in this century, we've begun building things, I guess last century, we've begun building things that are larger than any one person can really wrap their mind around, these huge mega projects. And so systems engineering has become more and more important, and breaking something down into smaller parts isn't just to help an individual, it's to help a group of people solve a problem that's bigger than any one person. So let me talk about a model for the typical engineer. So psychologists have done surveys and studies where they ask hundreds of you know, thousands of people about, you know, their personality and ways that they think about things, and then they correlate that with their profession. And it turns out that you know, there is a correlation between your profession and the type of personality that you have. Accountants and artists tend to be wired differently, okay? So oftentimes engineers are described as introverted, not always, you know, reliable, realistic, no nonsense, focused. Engineers want to get to the point. They want to create order out of chaos. Right? One of the rules of thermodynamics is entropy. Right? The chaos increases in the universe, and engineers are a bulwark against that. Sometimes engineers may not see the forest for the trees, or, you know, I think a better way to put that is, anytime you're approaching a problem, you can take the 50,000-foot view, or you can take the ground level view. And it's not wrong to look at things at a high level or a low level, but sometimes there's a correct level to look at things. And you know, engineers working on a problem don't always necessarily know or naturally send their minds to that correct level. So what's a typical customer? There is no typical customer. Sometimes customers don't know what they want, or they think they do. Sometimes customers do know what they want, but they don't necessarily have the words for it. Oftentimes customers can come from different cultures, different languages, different groups, and sometimes a customer will have a customer will have a customer. How often are you working with someone who is absolutely your interface, but they're somewhat removed from the actual end user or the actual source of the funding? So it can be really difficult sometimes to kind of know who to please. Sometimes customers may have a lot of expertise with the domain that you're working with. Imagine if you're a hand surgeon and you go in for hand surgery. You know, you may be a lot more involved with what the you know, as a customer, you may be more involved with your service provider, or sometimes your customer may have skills in some part of what they're asking you to do. So the fundamental challenge here is that engineers are searching for and trying to create order out of chaos, and customers don't always provide that order. So it's kind of like a square peg in a round hole. And in this effort to create order, some of the nuanced or latent customer needs can be forgotten or ignored. You know, if a customer comes and they want something, but they can't quite describe it, the personality of the engineer may lead them to kind of make some assumptions and simplifications. And this is a feature, not a bug. It's a virtue to be able to kind of cut through some ambiguity and you know, focus on development. But if you're not careful, you may lose some of the value that you could have gotten from that ambiguity. So what is the voice of the customer? The way that I'm defining it, you know, I didn't look this up from Merriam-Webster, I just thought about it. And the way that I would define the voice of the customer is the influence or feedback from the customer on those who develop and provide the products and services for the customer, right? It's not necessarily their actual voice. This is very important. And this is kind of a core. We're going to talk about different forms of the voice of the customer, but just keep in mind that the message, regardless of who the messenger is or what the messenger is, it's important that this message get through. Sometimes you've got to pull this message, and sometimes the message is getting pushed. So how are different ways that this message or this voice of the customer can be encoded? Well, you may have direct communication. And when I say you, this is someone in the organization. We're going to talk about interfaces in a little bit. So you may have direct communication with the customer. Oftentimes, a customer may be present at design reviews. You may have regular status calls with a customer. You may explicitly call them up and interview them about a particular topic. You may have informal phone calls. You know, we had a situation with a customer where we weren't exactly sure what they wanted on this particular point. And we were discussing, well, we just need to talk to the customer and we need to find out exactly what they want. But, you know, I didn't think that the customer necessarily knew what they wanted or that they were aware that this was an issue. And so we talked about how we needed to educate ourselves and bring to the customer some, you know, analysis and breakdown and recommendations rather than just come and say, hey, we don't have this figured out. what do you want us to do? Because that puts a lot of burden on the customer that they're not necessarily able to satisfy. Sometimes this voice of the customer may be explicitly written in the contract or the statement of work, which is often a document that goes right along with the contract. And that's great. That's easy. You know, if it's in the contract, it's something that everyone can look at. When you're establishing the contract, it's good to, if you can, to enshrine in that contract what are the key things that the customer is going for. However, sometimes part of the job, part of the work, part of the value that an engineering organization can provide is to establish, you know, what are the positive outcomes. The customer has a problem and they don't necessarily know what the solution looks like. They just believe that you can solve that problem and they have a general idea. And so in that case, you know, you're not always able to rely on a contract that was written before you establish what, you know, what success looks like. So sometimes, and I know that most of the people on this call are in the space industry. I've crafted this to be a little bit more generic, but sometimes if you're building a product for lots of different people, you don't necessarily have a one-on-one relationship with the customer. And does that mean that the customer doesn't matter? No. In that case, you may rely on business intelligence reports, you know, Google searches, YouTube, social media. If you're making a lemonade, for example, you don't necessarily go to one person and find out what kind of lemonade that one person wants. You need to learn kind of generally what is the market looking for in that. If you're seeking government contracts, one great source to look at is the budget. In the United States federal government and in the European Space Agency, they establish the budget, and you know what their priorities are because they put their money where their mouth is. They're showing their priorities by where they're allocating their funds, and then you can say, okay, these are the problems that that these governments are trying to solve. The United States has something called the Decadal Survey, where they ask scientists, you know, what are the priorities that they're trying to solve. Different government organizations will have, you know, will publish reports and generate reports on what are the problems that they're trying to solve. And so that's an example where you can kind of model or create a voice of the customer when there's actually no one talking. Another thing that I found helpful is if you're creating a product, you can kind of create a hypothetical customer. For example, you're developing a launch vehicle, and you know that people want rockets. You know that there's a need for a rocket, but you don't necessarily have a customer who's committed funds to you. And so what you can do is you can, you know, imagine and hypothesize reference missions or reference vehicles or reference capabilities and say, you know what, we believe that a large segment of the market is going to want this particular launch capability, and you can develop you know, a concept of operations to satisfy that. Okay, once you actually have paying customers, in the course of developing a product, particularly aerospace products and space exploration products, you're going to be creating specification and requirements documents. And this is something where, I mean, you know, a lot of the people on this call are systems engineers, and so I won't belabor the point, but it's important to put that in the contract and to use those documents as, you know, kind of gathering points for sharing ideas with the customers. And so, you know, if you create a specification and nobody reads it and no one sees it, then, you know, it doesn't do as much good. And that's one of the things that NanoRacks really appreciates about Valley Space is that they provide that the abilities to share and kind of make it a packet of information that you can share with customers and other stakeholders. Okay, Other areas where the voice of the customer comes, performance reviews. NASA does this with their contractors. You can read about, for example, SLS performance reviews, where regularly they'll come and they'll say, okay, here's how you're doing, and here's where we thought you'd be. Whether or not you get repeat business is definitely a message. And sometimes there's kind of management, backroom, I should say grapevine, just kind of higher level conversations where you can get more nuanced feedback that doesn't necessarily fit in a performance review or on a status call. Some products you may get, on Amazon. I know that I look for products that have 5-star ratings, and it's so valuable to get that feedback from the customer. Okay, so be thinking about how the voice of the customer is manifested on the projects that you work on, and later on we're going to discuss that a little bit. Okay, so what is the customer interface? One size does not fit all. Not in this industry, probably not in many others. Because as we were talking about, the customer may be technical or non-technical. They may have domain knowledge or not. They may want to be involved or not. So this is the Sistine Chapel here. Now, I don't know how much Michelangelo was paid, but let's assume that he was a painter and he had a customer, okay? And Michelangelo was good at painting. And his customer was somewhat of an authority on, religious, spiritual matters. And so imagine conversations that Michelangelo may have had with his customer about paintbrushes or painting technique. That's not necessarily something that would be very useful or helpful. Would be for Michelangelo, who is an expert, who knows everything that he needs to know about painting, to talk about his technique, to talk about his process. On the other hand, what we see in this image is a lot of the subject of his painting, and his customer probably was and should have been involved in the details and the the content of what Michelangelo was doing. And so that's an example where when you think about how to have an interface and on what topics you need to engage with the customer, you should think about what the competencies are of your customer. What are they experts at, and what is your organization experts at? What are your engineers particularly skilled at? And it can change from project to project. So that interface is very important. And at NanoRex, we have a terrific mission management organization. And that's a lot of the value that we provide, is that we provide customer service. We have people that travel to your site. They write up these documents and ICDs, and there's a lot of mission-specific work. This idea of mission-specific is something that pops up over and over again in aerospace, particularly for systems that are used lots of times. So when you have a launch vehicle or a space vehicle, you want to build it in such a way that it's repeated and it's used and it provides value over and over again. But at the same time, there are certain things that must be mission specific, like the orbit, like the launch. What day are you going to launch? No two rockets are launching at the same time. And there's a lot of analysis that goes with that. So it's important to not be too rigid in thinking, I've done this 100 times, or I know how to do this, and I don't want people to be involved with my next time of doing this, because there's a certain amount of customization that, if you're not customizing your products, if you're not doing mission specific work, you're just not doing a lot of work, because, yeah. Okay, so it's important to set those expectations with the customer and build that relationship each time. So there's another couple of important words that come up, and that's insight and oversight, okay? So on the right, we see an image from a document that NASA created in 2010 about the insight and oversight for the Commercial Crew Program. I'm sure you're all aware, SpaceX launched some astronauts to the space station a couple weeks ago, and it was a fantastic success. It was a different way of doing things. And when NASA set out on this program, they said, you know what? We are going to be deliberate and conscious and mindful about how much insight and oversight we're having in this program. What is insight? Insight is the amount of visibility and knowledge that a customer has in the development process, okay? So if you've got a factory, you know, does the customer have the keys to the factory? Can the customer walk around your factory and see what's going on? Oversight, on the other hand, is an authority of the customer to control what you're doing. So can the customer turn the knob? Can the customer choose to slow down that conveyor belt or turn up that heater? And, you know, sometimes that's appropriate and sometimes it's not. And if we can understand that, like, you know, to have a broad enough view to know that there is value in all of these, you know, where we can fall on this matrix of the customer knowing, not knowing, being involved, not being involved, then we'll be able to more effectively take advantage of opportunities with customers. So for the SpaceX launch, NASA stepped back and they said, you know what? We want astronauts on the space station, and you must prove to us that it will be safe, but otherwise, you can choose how many engines, you can shoot, you know, are you going to have a reusable rocket or not? How are you going to do launch escape? You know, your parachutes, all of these are things that SpaceX was able to choose, and that ended up being a tremendous value to the customer. You know, going back to that idea of the hand doctor, you know, and the hand surgeon, so a hand doctor getting hand surgery may actually provide value if they do have insight or oversight into that process. So, okay. Let's see. All right, so what is a good product? You know, there's a danger in oversimplifying. And there's also utility in knowing that swap size, weight, power, and cost. Those are things that are pretty universal. Those are things that, not always, but are often things that if you can focus on those, you'll have a successful product in the aerospace industry. And not everyone on this call is in aerospace, but aerospace is an interesting industry where everything is so constrained that you know, you have to simultaneously you know, apply materials constraints and volume constraints and strength constraints, and so you end up finding, and with launch costs, you end up finding that if you can reduce size, weight, power, and cost, that generally will equate to having high performance. And so what may happen is, you know, engineers who are very familiar in their field may have techniques and methods and knowledge on improving these generally useful aspects or improving the state of the art, but that's not necessarily what the customer cares about every time. So consider these three very different products. What is a high performance vehicle? What is a high performance computer? What is a high performance bridge? Now, with a vehicle, you want something that's fast, maybe has good gas mileage. With a computer, you may not care at all about power. You may want it to be, you know, the best graphics, you know, the greatest sound, and power is not something that's important to you. So I'm trying to highlight that we shouldn't take for granted that we know, or that the answer is the same every time on what is high performance. But what we need to do is we need to, you know, understand from the customer what are the things that they care and don't care about. NanoRx has had a mission recently where through some quirk in contracting, we had excess mass. Okay, we could have something that was heavier than what we typically would do. And so that's an opportunity for us to reduce costs and give the customer what they actually care about, and not do our typical traditional process of reducing mass and finding a mass optimized solution. You know, another key word to think about here is optimization. You engineers optimize, and who tells them what they're optimizing for. If the customer is not involved in what is the metric that is being optimized, then you may not provide the greatest value. So quantifying performance, again, a lot of systems engineers on the call, but I talk about this in a couple different contexts. So you might model a system where, for example, on a launch vehicle, where you simultaneously have engines being developed and the outer mold line and structures with their masses. You may bring that all into a model where way before you've built it, you have a prediction on what the integrated vehicle performance would be. You may build prototypes. You may have pilot programs where you roll out, kind of a minimum viable product to a smaller group of people, and you start getting that feedback. ConOps, it can be as much as a simulation of a mission. It doesn't have to be. For example, when NASA decided to go to the moon, originally, there was a very healthy debate about how to do it. Do we want one rocket, one really big rocket? Do we want lots of little rockets? Are we going to send everything to the surface of the moon? Are we going to orbit and do lunar orbit rendezvous? And so that's an example where way before you do the development, you're able to characterize different kind of manifestations of your potential development. And by comparing these alternate visions of the future, you're able to discern the differences and know, oh, I actually like that, or no, I don't like that. And what's important is to get the customer's feedback on that, because if the customer says, I want to go to the moon and I've never even thought about it, then you can present to the customer these different kind of competing visions on how to get there and say, we can do it this way, we can do it that way. What is it that you want? We recommend this because of these advantages. I've got an image here of a sample port, and I think a lot about sample ports, or just sampling a process as it's going, whether or not it's a development process or a hiring process. It's important to have that visibility, because imagine if you had a beverage factory, and the beverage came out at the end and it tasted bitter, and you didn't want it to be bitter, and all you knew is that you put in the right ingredients. If you're not able to sample it along the way and get customer validation, you may find yourself having expended a lot of energy and effort without actually providing the customer something that they want. Now, something that's not always as cut and dry in systems engineering for functional decomposition is that gray area between kind of distilling from less structured customer desires the actual requirements. And so I want to talk about the difference of ground rules and assumptions. So ground rules are things that are established by the customer. All right, customer wants a mouse trap, okay, to catch mice, and they may want it to be made out of non-toxic materials and be battery powered. And the engineer, he doesn't care. He can do it lots of different ways, but he can accept that constraint. And so it's important to ask the customer and establish what those ground rules are, because it can accelerate the development process and also avoid making the wrong choices. Assumptions, on the other hand, and again, this is an arbitrary distinction, but it's a useful distinction to make. And so when I define these differences, it's to create value, and not because this is the only way to define an assumption. But right now, I'll say an assumption is a constraint or solution assumed by the developer. Okay, so in the example of a mousetrap, the developer might say, okay, I have a warehouse full of 9-volt batteries, and so I'm going to assume that we're going to use a 9-volt battery as opposed to some other battery. And the customer might come and say, well, I'd rather have 10 volts, but I can understand how we're going to accelerate and move forward faster if we kind of sub-optimize the voltage so that we can optimize the cost, and that you already have 9-volt batteries. So this is an important way that you can take what could be a wishy-washy, non-specific intent of the customer, and bring it to something that everyone can agree on and that is actionable for the engineers to move forward with. Okay, so the product lifecycle, yeah, we should all be familiar with this. Oh, pardon me. Let's see. At every step, can you all see my PowerPoint? Great. Okay. So at every step in the product lifecycle, there's opportunities to involve the customer, which doesn't mean that you should involve the customer, you know, at every step. But again, that goes back to in that upfront negotiation and decision about how the customer should be involved. So concept studies, of course, that's important to involve the customer in it. And rather than go through each one of these, because we're kind of running to the end of the time, I just want to say that if you're thoughtful and mindful about it, you can save so much cost, you can provide so much more value by keeping the development grounded. And engineers, they love to solve problems. And if you can organize the engineering effort such that the engineers are solving the customer's problems, in addition to other problems, but make sure that the engineers have empathy and a desire to solve the customer's problems, then you know, you'll find that motivation is aligned. Because when the customers are a burden, when they're a bother, when they're, you know, an uninformed and meddlesome distraction from the, you know, fun engineering of actually making what you want to make, you know, that's not a recipe for success. It's not a recipe for future business, which is how you're able to, you know, how we're able to work on these projects in the first place. So, so every situation and business is different. You know, each contract is often different. And if engineers and leaders and managers are mindful, then we can really forge the connection and the process so that you know, there's a synergy and an appreciation and a collaboration, as opposed to, you know, the attention between these engineering activities. So, you know, welcome this challenge, embrace it, and plan for it, and you know, we'll all be in more business. Solve more problems. Okay, so I'm just about done. I wanted to throw up a couple of these questions on the screen. Please, you know, consider these and perhaps share some of those now. Marco, I'm not sure exactly how we're going to do this, but what types of interfaces do your organization have with the customer? Is it effective or not? When has a customer surprised you late in the development with a new need? On what subjects are your customers experts on that you may not be? When have you had to compromise with a customer on performance of a product? Something that you came together and said, you know, this is something that we're going to have to do. When have you identified a need that the customer didn't even know that they had? What about your products are you proud of but don't even matter to your customers, or they may not be aware? And when has a customer wanted you to do something completely differently than how it's ever been done? So these are questions that I hope we can talk about some of these now, and otherwise, Marco, what's next? Oh, I think I need to, Marco has raised his hand. Marco.
Yes, now I have the ability back to talk. So John, thank you very much. I think there's a big round of applause going on here in just on all the muted channels. So thank you very much for the insightful talk. So what I would suggest is the following. For everyone who would like to ask a question, so please, there's like the participants list. So down on the, like, if you look at the lower part, there's like number of participants. What you can do there is you can click there, and then there's on the lower part of that, the ability to raise your hand. So I'll just, so that means that you can actually raise your hand there, and then Maria will basically unmute you one by one for everyone who raises the hand. So on the lower part where it says participants, click there, and then you should be able to see all the participants. At the lower part, there's a way to raise your hand, basically. But until then, what I would like to do is I would like to ask a first question myself, because I think what you said is very, very interesting, that you want basically that influence of the customer, because in the end, I mean, the business is driven by the customer. However, it's also a dangerous thing, and I think that's maybe an aspect that you could elaborate a bit on. How do you make sure that like that influence of the customer doesn't actually take a hit on your business, right? Like, how do you make sure that to listen sufficiently to that person, but not to listen so much that you go bankrupt?
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to the interface with the customer. If you're able to have someone at your organization who is specifically skilled and wired to manage that relationship, then that can take a lot of the burden off the engineer, so that you know, when the customer comes and says, hey, I want you to, you know, make this little change, the engineer doesn't have to defend their design choices. So at NanoRacks, we have a customer management organization, and what we're able to do is to establish early on, you know, kind of at the beginning, what are the areas that the customer is going to have input on, and thinking about insight and oversight. If you can establish and set those expectations, and even put it in the contract, conceivably, to protect yourself and say, we're going to have this design review, and you're not invited, or you are invited, but you know, you're going to support virtually, and those are the types of things where you can anticipate, you know, potential misunderstandings or areas where you may distract the customer with details that they're not necessarily going to be able to add much value. So I want to be a little more specific on the answer, but I think that it really comes down to non-technical, you know, relationships, and that relationship may be contractual, and it should be personal, or I guess not personal, but interpersonal, with someone who is explicitly identified as that interface.
And when you say that you bring those in, like that you have that part in your own organization, these people, would you say that you basically also make them inside your own company the voice of the customer? Like, do you bring purposefully the conflict that you would usually have maybe outside, where you have to, like, where the customer wants something, you hit back? Do you bring that conflict on purpose inside the organization, where you have someone lobbying for the customer because that's the direct point? Or would you say that's something that should always be in the boundary between company and the customer?
I think that anytime you have a room of people debating a problem, you want to have people who at least are knowledgeable or sympathetic about different approaches for the problem. Okay, so that goes beyond, that transcends customer. That's just, you know, diversity of opinion, diversity of viewpoint. And so, you know, I mean, we're all familiar with the idea of a devil's advocate. Where you don't have productivity, or, you know, where you can miss things, is where you have everyone in the room just talking about how a customer or how a stakeholder is wrong. So on the projects that we work on at NanoRacks, our mission management organization is a member and a valued member that provides really cherished input for our engineering process. But if you don't have that in your organization, then, you know, someone in the room needs to say, well, let's look at it from the other point of view. Right?
Yeah, great. That's a good insight. So again, to everyone, maybe if you didn't find the option to like raise your hand in the participants list, then you can also write a message here to Maria directly, or to me, and we can also unmute you or read your question if you want to have it in writing. but as long as there's not I'll take advantage that there's not yet the first hand risen. People seem to be a bit shy yet today. So I'll come with another question that I have to, and what I was wondering is sometimes you have a product that is reused, like you were talking about this before, right? You have a product that you will want actually to give to several customers, even if you have to do customization, but you still want to provide it to several. How do you make sure to know who to listen to the most, right? You might have like 10 customers already, and you might have another 10 potentials. Like, do you listen to the person who screams the most and who's like has the strongest opinions? Do you listen? How do you make sure to balance that?
I think you listen to the person who's paying you. You listen to the person who's giving you money. If you don't have anyone giving you money, then you can try and balance it. Yeah, I mean, just simply, once you can get to somebody paying you, even if someone's just paying you a study contract, even if someone, if you have a $20 million project and you just have a couple $100,000 study contract, that's so valuable to have an actual real user that is really paying you for them to give you constructive, valuable feedback.
Mm-hmm. And if you have several potential ones, like, and they want slightly different things, like how do you balance that? Like, how do you do you try to make up your mind what the market will tell you, or do you try to at least find the one most enthusiastic where you have a feeling they might close next, or like what's the strategy?
Yeah,
there?
Well, so it's not always either or. We have a platform that you can put in lots of different experiments on the space station. And we built this not knowing who our future customers are, but we do have some past customers. And so what we've done is we've tried to envelope what past and future customers are likely to do, so that we don't have to choose between one or the other. Should we have 200 watts or should we have 150 watts? Well, it's not really either or, it's and, right? Now, sometimes there are harder choices, like, are we going to use USB 2 or are we going to use USB 3? And we actually built an adapter. So again, it can be either. One other interesting example, the key word here is envelope, right? Now, it costs more to build something that's generally applicable. And so you can perform a, quantitative analysis saying, how big of a bucket do I create? How much money can I bring in with that bucket? Is that enough money to justify the cost of building the bucket? With launch vehicle fairings, for example, there's been at least one fairing where they looked at all their competitors and they drew the nose cone and they just traced the outside outline and said, bam, we know that everyone's going to be able to fly with us because we're bigger. We've enveloped everyone else.
Yeah, that's quite a strategy if you can pull it off, right? Which is, as you say, is always a bigger risk than. Maria, did you already see any questions raised to you? Because I don't see yet a hand risen. If you want to share any of your experiences for the questions that like John has put up here, that's also very welcome. So if it's not a question.
I think I just had a question here. So from Devin, how do you recommend effective communication between business developments and production work? For example, what we tell the customer we can do versus what the customer ultimately gets delivered. Right.
Well, there's two. Communication can go both ways. A production facility can inform business development. This is something that we can easily do with a low cost. On the other hand, business development can say, hey, we need to have the ability to perform this certain function in order to make more sales. And so the answer to that question, I think, can depend on which way that communication can go. But this can be specific to the organization because the world is run by people. It's not run by processes. It's not run by by simple, straightforward rules. So if we were to talk about the right way to build an organization, that's a different topic, and it's an important topic, one that I care a lot about. But I think that communication in and of itself, having structured meetings where management, may include people who aren't in management as well, but having that identification and expression of what the problems are, what the opportunities are, goes so far in allowing an organization to connect the dots. We developed something recently, and we brought the technician in to examine the drawing. And this technician, she identified an area, a process that she thought was going to be particularly difficult. And we were able to bring in lots of different stakeholders to discuss the manufacturing of this process. So, with business development, I'm sorry that I can't have a specific answer that's applicable broadly, but other than try and seek out that regular communication, if not between the technicians and the business development people, then between the managers, because and here's another thing. We've talked about customers. I mean, but customers, my customer is my CEO. My customer is people who report to me. We can all view each other as customers in a certain way. I've told the engineers at Nanorex that I want them to view the people in project management and mission management as customers, and try and satisfy what these different stakeholders are doing. So we can think of lots of people within our own organization as customers.
Great, thanks a lot.
We have just one more question, if I may.
Let's do the last one.
From Sebastian. How would you go about making your customer jump into the unknown by pursuing your technology, although disruptive and literally a whole reality away from their current solution?
Right.
In my case, the pressure layer of spacesuits.
The pressure layer of spacesuits.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of different customers. Some customers want to do new game-changing development, and some customers want to reduce risk and want to buy things that that they know about. And so it's a lot easier if you find customers who want game-changing development. If you don't, then you need to communicate to the customer about the risk reward, right? So take Elon Musk, for example. He is working on Starship, and what a great reward that's going to be, but it's different, it's new. And so as opposed to the Falcon 9, which he's able to sell like hotcakes, even though it's not necessarily a much better price than Starship, when you look at kilograms per pound, there's a lower risk there. Now, NASA paid initially for the development of the Falcon 9 when it was a higher risk. And so I think that the way to, if you're working on a new spacesuit technology and you don't have a high technology readiness level, which is this measure of, this quantifiable, broadly understood way of quantifying the maturity of something, then the easiest thing is to find a customer who's looking to improve that technology. And then the next thing, which isn't so easy, is to articulate the advantages and how, for the customer, they will survive, risk management. That they'll be able to survive the risk, and they will benefit greatly from your success.
Thanks, John. I think this has been really a lot of interesting insights. So I would like to thank you very much for being the first speaker at the first Jarvis Con. That was a great opening. And I would like to thank everyone for having joined. Tune in next week. We're going to have Sam Avery from Momentous Space. He's going to be talking about agility in complex spacecraft design, integration, and testing. So I'm looking forward to see you and many more of your colleagues maybe also there. So let us also know via email later if you found this interesting, what you would like to have next time. On the Jarvis website, you can also sign up for a newsletter to be informed when we do the next conference. So we are now having like 4 talks in the next 4 weeks. However, we're also planning on doing an on-premise conference next year in Lisbon. So let us know if you're interested and what topics we should cover and which other speakers we should have. Let us all know all of these things. And until then, I would like to say thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And we wish you a very nice evening, morning, wherever you are. So see you soon. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.